It's great to be sharing this historic moment in this wonderful gathering of solidarity with Cuba to celebrate and cherish the memory of Comandante Fidel. In fact, at this very moment, as we are talking here, a strong Indian delegation has traveled along with thousands of other people from all over the world who are today in Havana celebrating and commemorating the beloved and cherished memory of Fidel. And we join our voices with them and with the Cuban people, with the brave Cuban people. The question is, how do we remember Fidel? We remember Fidel, of course, as a towering and decisive figure in the numerous events that have taken place in the history, in human history, in the 20th century, in the 21st century, not only in Cuba, not only in Latin America, but in the entire world. We remember him for the leadership that he has given to the Cuban people as they broke the chains of US domination and opened a new chapter in the history of Cuba and in the history of Latin America and in the history of Global South. They showed, the Cuban people showed to us under the leadership of Fidel that it was possible to take in their own hands the nation's destiny and to place human needs above private profit. Despite decades of blockade, sabotage, and a propaganda war against it, Cuba has remained steadfast in maintaining its dignity and building a highly educated and cultured society, a socially conscious society. We remember Fidel as the one who led the Cuban people to set a new milestone in the struggle for human solidarity and human unity, as they fought, as the Cuban people fought alongside their African brothers for the freedom of Africa. Fidel's internationalism was never rhetorical. It was always practical and it was lived, as we saw in the famous battle of Cuitacuanavale in 1988 and 1987 in Angola, where Cuba and the Cuban volunteers, internationalists, played a decisive role in the victory of Angolan independence against the racist forces, and then that led on to the independence of Namibia and to the end of the apartheid state in South Africa, so that in 1994, Nelson Mandela could become the first black president ever of South Africa. We can never forget the role of Fidel's leadership in Cuba's internationalist forces in Africa. Of course, Cuban medical internationalism has always been a beacon of what human solidarity can look like in action. It is a natural outgrowth of the revolutionary principles that Fidel had instilled in the people. We remember Fidel also as the first statesman who in 1992, in the famous speech in Rio, warned us against the climate change, when this word was hardly used, when leaders barely ever talked about it. Fidel gave that famous speech where he said, "Tomorrow it will be too late." We remember Fidel also for how he has stood with the Cuban women. The Cuban Revolution triumphed, and within a year, the Federation of Cuban Women was formed. Vilma Espin, being one of the founders of the Cuban Federation of Women. And today, Cuba has one of the most progressive family codes in the world. And it is in 2023, after a discussion in almost every neighborhood, that Cuba, in its typical style of participatory democracy, evolved this family code, which gives gender equality and places the women in Cuba with such rights that people like us, who are working in the feminist movement and women's movement in India would love to reach. We also remember Fidel as a beloved friend of India and cherish that historical moment when our Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru became the first person to call on the young 34-year-old Fidel as the Prime Minister of Cuba in Hotel Teresa in Harlem, when the Cuban delegation in 1961, was it 61, was denied, in the US, was denied a hotel accommodation. And at that time, Jawaharlal Nehru became the first person to go and visit him. And you know what he said? This was September 28. In fact, in the photo exhibition, there is a photograph with Fidel and Jawaharlal Nehru and V.K. Krishna Menon. And Nehru said that I wanted to meet you for many reasons, but above all, because you are a very brave man. We also cherish the historic visit of Fidel to India in 1973 first, when he just, on his way to Vietnam, stopped over in New Delhi and then in Kolkata. But I particularly remember the March 1983 visit of Fidel, who had come here as the chairperson of the non-aligned movement to pass on the baton to India and to Indira Gandhi. I remember because I was a final year student of MA Spanish in Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi then, and we were given the task of being volunteers in the Ashoka Hotel where the delegates were staying. So heavy security was deployed in the hotel, and because Fidel was staying there, and they in fact used lookalikes of Fidel to manage the security risk. Yeah. So I'm not sure that the person whose glimpse I got was Fidel or whether it was his lookalike. But we cherish the memory of Fidel when in his presence, an Indian delegation comprising of Comrade Harkishan Singh Sujit, Comrade M.A. Baby, and Mr. K.N. Singh, the Congress MP, when Fidel received the ship Caribbean Princess in Havana, carrying the donation from India of 10,000 tons of grain in 1992 in the special period, and in his characteristic style, he called it 10,000 tons of solidarity. How else should we remember Fidel? There must be 100 ways on his centenary. We can think of 100 ways of giving his, rich life, his legacy of resistance. What are those aspects of Fidel's life that enable the Cubans, that calls on Cubans not to despair but to organize, not to retreat but to resist and to struggle? We all know that in the recent times, the United States has been flexing its military and economic muscle all over the globe. After its quick victory in Venezuela on 3rd January in 2026, when Nicolas Maduro, the legitimate president of Venezuela, was militarily abducted from his abode and taken away to the United States, an emboldened Trump administration has intensified its illegal blockade on Cuba. The US policy has been to block the oil, block the trade, block the blanks, but they have not been able to block the spirit of the Cubans. They have not been able to block the solidarity for Cuba that we are expressing ourselves here, standing firmly with socialist Cuba. And Cuba, that is today celebrating the centenary of its beloved leader, continues to be a socialist Cuba. As you all know, I don't have to say this because all of you have friends of Cuba, and you must have followed the recent happenings. In January 2029, the Trump administration, through its Executive Order 14380, imposed an oil blockade. I'm sure that the ambassador will talk about these details, but the fact is that the UN experts have called this an energy starvation, blocking the oil to a country. And then came another executive order in May 2026, and it imposed those secondary sanctions. Now today, it's not just US companies that don't trade with Cuba. Any non-US entity, any company beyond the US also, which wants to maintain commercial relations with the Cuban state, will be targeted through secondary sanctions. And the result has been that several companies who did trade with Cuba have exited the island, which has further deteriorated the economic asphyxiation of Cuba. Since then, I think I should also mention that one of the most devastating things that the US has done is, apart from the companies, foreign companies exiting, they have also targeted specific companies and individuals within Cuba. And one of the companies that they have targeted is the GAISA. The GAISA is a business group. It's a private group, which is private in the sense it's a private entity. It is 60% owned or run by the revolutionary armed forces, and it was created in the special period precisely as a counter to the economic warfare that was being waged against Cuba after the collapse of the socialist bloc. In fact, Fidel has said in his speeches that it is not a blockade, it's an economic war against Cuba. He has always said that it's an economic war. And we can see that when Gaesa, was created during the special period precisely to counter the effect of the economic warfare, today the world's policeman has targeted Gaesa, this Cuban company, for its sin of sustaining the Cuban economy under pressure. As you all know, on June 18, the National Assembly of the People's Power in Cuba has effected far-reaching economic and social reforms. There are a lot of intense debate about these reforms inside Cuba and outside Cuba. There are doubts being expressed. Has Cuba left its socialist path? And I'm sure that the Cuban representatives here will certainly talk about it. But I can only say that as an outsider, the tremendous amount of debate that took place, not just in the assembly, but even before the assembly, in the Cuban people, from years this debate has been going on. So for those who say that it is being done under US pressure, I think one thing is clear. For any Latin Americanist like me who has been kind of following Cuba, it is clear that Cuba has always known how to adapt and resist. That adaptation happened in the special period, and that adaptation is happening even now. Undoubtedly, these 170 plus economic measures which have been taken will profoundly affect the economic and social structure of Cuba as it is today. In fact, Miguel Diaz-Canel mentioned after the National Assembly that he had thought, that the reforms were passed unanimously by the National Assembly of People's Power. And the president of Cuba said to the journalists that I was surprised because I had thought that they would be voting against it also. But it was unanimously passed because the Communist Party and the deputies of the Cuban people, the Cuban representatives in the National Assembly, realized that these reforms were indispensable and unstoppable. So, this hybrid war that is being waged against Cuba, on the one hand, the economic warfare, on the other hand, the media warfare and the psychological warfare. Every day in the news you read that there's going to be a military invasion. Imagine living in a small country with the threat of, military anything, the US military anytime invading your nation. Imagine what it does to your psyche. Imagine living under that kind of a threat. Of course, we know that the Palestinians live with that threat. And that is why Cuba has been called a Palestine without bombs. The kind of intensity of the attack on Cuba is really unprecedented. I mean, the hardship that the Cuban people are going through is severe. We have heard of the power outages, which are lasting for 20 hours, shortages of medicine, shortages of fuel, shortages of food. And then the Western media invokes all these scenes and say, look, socialism is failing. Look, the state has failed. So this entire propaganda of a failed state, I think it is very clear to anyone who has been following that the Western media basically wants to, talk about the inevitable collapse of the Cuban state through their propaganda war. But Cuba continues to resist all this psychological pressure, this economic coercion, and all these have failed to force the surrender of Cuban sovereignty. The country is so small. It's a small, tiny island. So why does the US fear? I think Rohini, you had also mentioned, why does the US fear Cuba? The US fears Cuba precisely because of this defiance, this enduring defiance, this lasting resistance. This defiance has historical roots, and I think I must mention that throughout the 19th century, successive US administrations had developed what they call the ripe fruit theory. You see, most of the Latin American nations had got their independence by 1810, 1820. Cuba, Puerto Rico were the only two in Latin America which had not got their independence, and they got independence in 1898. And the US administration, successive US administrations used to say that once Cuba gets independence from Spain, it will naturally fall into our lap. The ripe fruit theory. I can't say it in Tamil, but I'm sure that in Tamil it will sound wonderful when you say that, when the fruit will get ripened, it will fall into our lap. So that was the kind of, but the fruit did not fall into their lap. The fruit did not fall into the lap. The fruit grew its seeds within the island nation. And today we have a resilient, resistant Cuba, which is standing up to US imperialism. I must also say that while these are the historical roots of defiance in Cuba, it is equally true that the Cuban Revolution triumphed in 1959. And those were the times of McCarthyism. Those were the times of fanatical anti-communism in the United States. In the universities, professors were being targeted. I mean, you know about what McCarthyism was like. In a famous master lecture, which Fidel gave in the Central University of Venezuela in Caracas in 1999, Fidel recounted that, after the triumph of the revolution, he used to go and speak to ordinary citizens. And he would ask them, what do you think of agrarian reform? What do you think, how nice it would be if you had your home available to you rather than paying rent to the landlord? And do you agree that the banks which have the people's money should not be owned by private entities? They should belong to the people. And do you agree that these large factories, most of them are foreign owned, they should be owned by the people and produced for the people, and their products, the profits should go to the people? And people would say, yes, 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 we agree with all your proposals. And then Fidel would say, so you agree with socialism? And no. Socialism, no. Because of these prejudices, socialism was a cursed word. And imagine, so let us not imagine that it was easy to build a socialist consciousness in Cuba just because the revolution had triumphed. And that is why Fidel has always called the revolution a work of art, a process rather than a finished product. So, how has tiny Cuba been able to develop its socialist, consciousness? Fidel said in one of the speeches, and I'm quoting him, in order to fight the US imperialism, what is needed is neither nuclear weapons nor great wars. What is needed is ideas. A revolution can only be the offspring, can only be born from culture and ideas. And that is why I'm really happy that the words to the intellectuals, has been made available in Tamil, because it's a foundational document of Cuban revolutionary cultural project. In 1961, it has been mentioned, we also saw it in the documentary, that the newly victorious revolution had launched this massive literacy campaign. Schools were closed, as Tamil Selvangaru was mentioning, that the schools were closed, the colleges were closed, and people went into the rural side, and in fact, Cuba became an international reference point for mass education. Cuba showed that a small country could invest heavily in education, in medicine, in culture, in international solidarity, and through these priorities, Cuba, being a small island, was able to spread its influence far beyond its borders. In this master lecture in the University of Caracas, Fidel said that people cannot be made revolutionary by force. Those who sow ideas don't need to repress the people. So for those who say that Fidel was a dictator, Fidel had this answer that we don't need to. You cannot be made revolutionary by force. An entire people cannot be made revolutionary by force. And that is why we find that Cuba invested heavily. I don't have time, I need to be finishing. But I'd just like to mention the Cuban Film School, the Cuban Casa de las Americas, which is a space for Latin American writers and artists, the Havana's International Book Fair. It has developed into one of the largest gatherings of authors and publishers. Even after the disintegration of socialist camp, in fact, after the disintegration of socialist camp, Fidel insisted on what he called the battle of ideas. And I think it's very important for us to translate some of those speeches, of Fidel on the battle of ideas. His main thing was that now we are living in the age of globalization and the battle has to be globalized. And do you know what he did? In 1999, he established the Latin American School of Medicine. The idea was that all these doctors who graduate out of free education from the Cuban medical school will go back to their countries and treat the poor people. So in 2026, I must tell you this figure, that in 2026, despite the kind of hardships that Cuba is facing, a total of 1,899 health professionals have graduated from the Latin American School of Medicine, including 1,160 doctors, 82 dentists, and 291 health technicians. These include 580 foreign students coming from 73 countries. And dear friends, 53 of them from Palestine. So it is from the cultural power of the revolution that Cuba has acquired this influence that it has in the world today, because culture can project political possibilities which armies cannot, which military invasions cannot, and which market cannot. I would like to therefore end by saying that one of the things that Fidel did not like at all was, personality cult. He did not like mythification and exaltation. In fact, in my university, Jamia Millia Islamia, I remember that in 2007, our Vice Chancellor Mushirul Hassan, who had this project of naming the university's buildings after third world intellectuals, so we have an Edward Said Hall, we have a Noam Chomsky Hall, we have a Nehru Guest House, and near the Nehru Guest House, we have the Castro Youth Cafe. And Mushirul Hassan Sahab wanted the Cuban ambassador to come and inaugurate the Castro Youth Cafe. The Cuban ambassador said, we are very grateful, but sorry, we cannot participate in the inauguration because Fidel has said, we in Cuba do not believe in the personality cult. So much so that Fidel had said that after my death, no building, no streets, no statues, no busts of mine should be erected anywhere. And today in Cuba, there is none, no street, no Cuba. So there are no andhbhakts. I don't know if you use that word in Tamil. In North India, we use the word andhbhakt, means blind followers. There are no blind followers in Cuba. Those who admire Fidel are because Fidel believed in the collective spirit of the people. I'm now translating along with my colleague, Dr. Shalini, his speeches into Hindi. Fidel's speeches, interviews, reflections, I think are a storehouse of a person who dared to create a new model of Cuban socialism, which was not a copy of any other model. And I think that is why we should look at Fidel also as an intellectual of the global South. Today, Fidel's legacy is alive in all the trenches of resistance and in all the movements that are resisting the ravages of neoliberalism. Fidel is there, present in spirit and an example, and he lives in every spirit of act of courage and in every act that dares to imagine that another world is possible. And therefore, along with the Cuban's ambassador, let us declare Fidel presente, hoy, mañana y siempre. Fidel is present today, tomorrow, and forever. Thank you very much.